Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you could please fill in with seats. If you can't find seats, we can produce some more. So we have some chairs, and we'll start filing along this direction. But I see plenty of empty seats, so please get cozy. Really glad to see this turnout. How's everybody feeling? Falling asleep? How's everybody feeling? All right, it's going to be a good night. It's summertime shy, beautiful people, and a great conversation tonight. So my name's Kelwin Harris. I'm the Chief of Civic Engagement for the Assessor's Office, and we've got an illustrious panel here. Books are being sold in the front, so if you do want to get a book in advance, the author, Andrew Karhl, will be signing afterwards, but books are being sold throughout the evening. And as people are being seated, yeah, we should have had one of those Instagram things where it like goes around in a circle and like, you know. Yeah, so guys, please welcome Lisa Lee, who's the Executive Director of the National Public Housing Museum, who we're really grateful to be here today. So please give her a hand.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And I really want to thank all of you for being here tonight for this important conversation. My name is Lisa, the ED of the National Public Housing Museum, and this is the temporary office for the National Public Housing Museum because we will be moving into our full space this summer. And you can clap for that. Yay! And for those of you who do not know, the National Public Housing Museum is the first and only cultural institution dedicated to telling the history and interpreting the history of public housing in the United States. And we not only interpret this history and preserve it, but we also propel the future of housing. And we address housing insecurity, one of the most important issues of our day. And we really fight for a world where housing is a human right and where everyone has a place to call home. Around 17 years ago, a group of public housing residents had the incredible vision of saving the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes on the near west side of Chicago, and to create a museum because they understood the power of place and memory. And also they fought for the right of never again would there be a single story, because at that time, there was a single story about public housing, and it was one based on a racialized history that had demonized public housing residents and had thought that public housing was simply a failed social experiment. But we know as historians, as activists, as advocates, as people who are fiercely committed to going upstream, which means going back in time and asking critical questions like, why are things the way it is now? How could it have been different? That we understood that it wasn't the people of public housing that had failed, but it was a series of systemic racism, of failed social policies, of things that we all need to learn from that have nothing to, not just to do with housing, but also have to do with public health, public education, public safety, policing who, that were acting with impunity and not providing public safety. And that if we were to come together and unleash our radical imaginations, we can not only understand history, but also forge a different future for all of us, one in which housing is truly a human right. So I'll just say very quickly that the museum includes not only 3 restored apartments from 3 different generations of public housing residents, a Jewish family that lived in public housing, stories about Puerto Rican families, and also an African-American family who lived in public housing. But we have an amazing range of public art. So for example, the second apartment is a collaboration between Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and Manuel Cinema that tells the history of systemic racism and redlining. The third apartment is a collaboration with Laurel Howery and Reverend Marshall Hatch. It tells the story of his family living there. And And that we have also the world's largest oral history collection of stories of public housing residents that we have gathered from across the nation. Our museum store is a cooperative that's owned with public housing residents that looks at the history of cooperative economies and really builds economic power. And there really is just so much. We want to be a cultural and a civic anchor for the city to explore the history of housing and to create a more just future. I really want to thank Mark Jaschke, who is a program coordinator here at the museum. This event wouldn't have happened without his help, so please join me in thanking him. I want to recognize also the collaborations that we have with the CHA and Related Midwest, which allowed us to have in the back of our building 15 units of housing, affordable housing, which is really wonderful. And also we have 2 board members here, Deborah Bennett and also Brad Hunt. And so thank you so much for their continuing support. And we're really excited to be partnering with the Cook County Assessor's Office and with Kellen. I'm going to turn it over. I'm really excited for this panel. Thank you all. Hi, Frank.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. And there are so many great tie-ins, as you guys will see throughout this conversation, to the space that we're in. So we're really excited to be with the National Public Housing Museum today. So I just want to thank Lisa again and talk to you guys a little bit about this panel that we're doing today. This isn't the first time that we've done this. This actually is a part of a series that the Cook County Assessor's Office has called Racial Equity and Real Estate Conversations that we've been doing kind of since the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of those panels used to be virtual, but they can be found on our website, I believe under the events section. But we're using our office as a platform to convene thought leaders and unpack the policies and practices that led to inequity in real estate, to expose past harms, and most importantly, seek out solutions to longstanding inequities and disparities in areas like homeownership, generational wealth building, and of course, tax assessments, which we'll talk about tonight. Some of our previous guests have been authors like Beryl Satter, Andre Perry, Kiangi Yamada Taylor, who was just mentioned, who will be a part of the Public Housing Museum, artists like Tanika Johnson, and urban historians like Sherman Dilla Thomas, everybody knows Dilla, and many, many others. So please check out our series. But tonight, we're extremely excited to talk about property tax assessments, specifically in the nature of the book by Andrew Karhl, The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. Following the conversation, there'll be time for Q&A, and Andrew will be signing books in the back. Again, books are for sale throughout the conversation today. And if you did get the handout in the front, I'm going to do some short bios, but these guys' bios are so extensive. The full bios, if you look at the QR code on your handout, you can read the full background. So let me start from the far left. Tracy Scott. Start with Tracy. Tracy is the CEO of the Chicago Housing Authority and the nation's 3rd largest public housing authority, which serves 65,000 Chicago families through its rental and homeownership programs. Since her appointment in 2020, Ms. Scott's focused the agency on building sustainable mixed-use, mixed-income communities, accelerated its rehabilitation of existing inventory, and expanded support services to create pathways for more families to achieve economic empowerment. She's a leading voice in the affordable housing sector and serves on national boards, including the Council of Large Public Housing Authority and many other organizations. Chris Berry is the William J. and Alicia Townsend Friedman Professor at the Harris School of Public Policy and the college, and director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation at the University of Chicago. He was the inaugural director of the Center for Municipal Finance and is a current faculty affiliate. He's the author of Imperfect Union, Representation and Taxation in Multi-Level Governments, Theory and Credibility, and many other scholarly publications. Frank Williams was president of the Southside Chicago chapter of the NAACP from 1979 to 1985. Frank is also quoted in the book. I believe it's page 235. Okay. 235. He knows. He already knows. Just start the book at page 235, okay, and go from there, and you'll be good. He was also the president of the Chicago Association of Realtors in 1989, Chicago Association of Realtor of the Year in 1992, and an inductee to the same agencies or associations Hall of Fame in 2017, among many other awards. Williams, the Dearborn Realtors. Yeah. And what year was that, Frank? 1973, the Dearborn Realtors. Does everybody know what the Dearborn Realtors are? Dearborn Realtors was the parallel organization when African Americans could not join the mainstream real estate organizations, still in existence today. And Frank was the president. So thank you for checking me, sir. Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I told you the full bio. If you click the QR code, all right, you're gonna get that. This is the abbreviated version, Frank. All right, but I appreciate that. Williams opened his real estate brokerage on the southwest side of Chicago, Beverly neighborhood. I believe it was Beverly, in January 1971. He was met with resistance from the community, branded a blockbuster for his efforts, advocating for fair housing, creating opportunities for Blacks to gain home ownership, experience firebombing, all of those things. So it's just great to see such living history with us today. Fritz Kaegi, the Cook County Assessor, since assuming office in 2018, Fritz has brought fairness, ethics, and transparency to the Cook County Assessor's Office with the vision focused on operational changes, technological upgrades, and the elimination of favoritism. Prior to beginning serving as assessor, Fritz spent more than 20 years valuing assets as a mutual fund portfolio manager and analyst, focusing on small companies operating around the world. He's a graduate of Kenwood Academy, Haverford College, and Stanford University. Okay. And Andrew Karhl, professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia, specializes in history and race and inequality in the 20th century U.S., with a focus on housing and real estate, land use and ownership, and local tax systems. He's been an author of a few books: The Land Was Ours, African American Beaches, From Jim Crow to the Sun Belt South; Free the Beaches, the story of Ned Cole, and the battle for America's most exclusive shoreline; and of course, The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America. And then last, I'm going to introduce our moderator and then turn it directly over to her. Ariane Netos is a lecturer and director of audio journalism programming at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. She's been a contributor to the likes of the New York Times Opinion, Chicago Reader, WTTW, WBZ, many others. She's also been the host of Is That True?, which is a podcast for youth. And then her most recent book, she has the most recent book herself, just came out a couple months ago. We Are the Culture, Black Chicago's Influence on Everything. Love that title. Please welcome this entire panel.
Thank you so much. We are going to hop right into it because we have a lot to get to, and we have this amazing panel. We don't want to waste any moments with them. So, Dr. Karhl, your book, of course, spans 150 years. We start around the Reconstruction period, and we go through the early 21st century. And that's a lot of history. Can you tell us, how did we get here? How did we get here to this point where we are talking about the Black tax today in 2024?
Sure. Can you all hear me? So, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is really just amazing to see everyone here and interested and engaged with these really important issues that I think have flown under the radar for too long. And I just want to establish right at the outset, I mean, the overtaxation of African-American neighborhoods and homeowners is really a problem almost as old as Black property ownership itself in America. My book really looks at the period of beginning with the end of Reconstruction and the rise also of African-American land ownership in America, and how at every turn African-Americans have been dealing with a local tax system that has consistently and relentlessly overassessed the homes and neighborhoods where African Americans live. And at the same time, those same tax systems have underserved those very same communities. And this is a problem that in particular has been sort of linked and traced to the history of housing and homeownership in Chicago. And I looked really at Chicago closely throughout the history of both from the Great Migration up to the present, and kind of asked this question right from the outset: is why has homeownership not worked for African Americans in the same way it has for white Americans? And I believe that really looking closely at how the tax assessment process has worked helps us to begin to understand some of the public policies and practices that have continued to fuel segregation and inequity in housing here in this city and across the country. And I'll say this, I mean, this is a problem that very much remains with us today. Nationwide, African American and Latino neighborhoods are assessed between 10 and 12% higher than white neighborhoods relative to value. This is a problem that has become a recurrent issue here in Chicago, but one that oftentimes has sort of been invisible. It's a subtle problem often, but nevertheless, over time has had really long-term and devastating consequences. And there's a couple of factors that I look at in particular that have contributed to this. One is the ways in which assessments have been oftentimes, and the assessment process has been oftentimes prone to favoritism and susceptible to manipulation within local assessors' offices. And that's certainly been the case in the history of Cook County's assessor's office, in that we've continually seen, and oftentimes I've sort of found that really the assessed value of properties has often more reflected the status of the holder of that property rather than the value of the property itself, with the most valuable properties and the most powerful property owners often being assessed relatively the least, and those lacking in power assessed the most. And this has had wide-ranging effects on housing markets in this city and cities across the country. Not only sort of adding extra costs and burdens to homeowners and renters who are paying indirectly in these higher taxes, but also fueled the sort of devaluation of the neighborhoods where African Americans live in, and contributed to these, this widening wealth gap that we continue to see in America today, that has been really one of the greatest measures of racial inequality. So one of the things that I also tell in this book, and I think it's a really important history that needs to be told, and I think part of why we're all here tonight is that there's been a long history of resistance to these efforts to tackle these problems. And I also sort of tell that history here in Chicago, beginning really in the early 1970s, when studies that were being done by a gentleman here in the audience tonight, Arthur Lyons, an expert on urban fiscal policy, who was doing work in the early 1970s, looking at patterns of assessment across neighborhoods, and finding that Black neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods especially, were being assessed at higher effective rates than properties in white residential areas. This also really came to light again in the later 1970s, when a similar study that was being done by Professor Lyons and his students at UIC found again that Black neighborhoods were being assessed for same properties, same property values, white neighborhood and Black neighborhood, the ones in Black neighborhoods were being assessed at higher levels. And this also was, again, something that galvanized Black Chicagoans to action. Harold Washington founded a Black Taxpayers Federation in the late 1970s, fighting for changes. And continually, we saw these organizations and movements running up against roadblocks, both at the local level, at the state, and at the federal level. And finding great deal of resistance oftentimes coming from the assessor's office here in Chicago. And I think that's really what's perhaps most remarkable about this night, is that we're here talking about these issues at an event hosted by the assessor's office. And I think, really it speaks volumes to the sort of political sea change that we're seeing here in the city, in that, an issue that had been, often buried and denied even by the assessor's office is now being tackled head on. And I think that really, we're at a really critical moment, I think, where we can begin to see that type of change happen.
Absolutely. And we definitely want to ask Assessor Kaegi some questions very specific to that. But just to set the stage for that question, in this book, as you've mentioned, Professor Karhl, for hundreds of pages for anyone who has not read the book just yet. There is no mention of the IRS in this book about taxes, right? Can you talk a little bit about how important the local tax system is to people compared to how, when we usually think about taxes, a lot of us think about that big, tax bracket and, oh, where do I fall on that federal level?
Yeah, I mean, local taxes are hugely important in so many ways. I mean, first of all, state and local taxes constitute, over 1/5 of all public dollars in this country, and they are have a huge impact on housing markets as a whole, not just sort of reflecting values within housing markets, but profoundly shaping those markets, which is something I show throughout the book, but also looking at where those public dollars go. I mean, local taxes fund public schools. They fund parks, playgrounds, libraries, local physical and social infrastructure, fire and public safety. So many of the sort of, literally the streets we came on to get here, the neighborhoods where we live in are profoundly shaped by the local tax systems that we're all a part of. And so I think it's one area where we can begin to see quite directly following that relationship, like literally following the money from where it's, what neighborhoods and what taxpayers it's coming from, and then where it's being devoted to. And so this is, again, one area where we can begin to really see sort of how tax policies and really how the public's money is spent in ways that we can then begin to sort of ask ourselves, is this actually reflective of the type of society we want to live in and the type of world we want to build?
Thank you. Thank you. And Assessor Kaegi, when you came into office, you were very open and vocal about these big issues that you wanted to tackle, issues that you had identified. Could you talk just a little bit more about what you wanted to do?
Sure. Well, you mentioned in my biography, I was a Kenwood Academy graduate. I think we might have some Broncos in here. It was connecting the work that I did. My job, as we mentioned in the bio, was I was managing money and I was investing in publicly traded companies around the world. And so I had a sense of idea of how these big buildings were valued. But then when I would go to my Kenwood reunions and talk to my classmates, this was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, when the housing crisis was really hitting people hard. And people don't like to talk about their own finances, but people would say, Fritz, you're a money guy. I'm upside down on my mortgage. Why are my taxes going up? And I didn't have an answer. But what I did is I tried to look at some of the research that was out there, and I didn't have a whole benefit of all the research that you did, but I saw that this had been a problem for a long time, that people were being overassessed in Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. Basically, everyone across the bottom of the price spectrum, there was a pattern of overassessment. And I saw that the big buildings how they were assessed had no relation with what I knew these big buildings to be worth from my own work. And then when I learned, I was involved in some programs like Leadership Greater Chicago, I made the connection. Oh, we have a zero-sum system here. So if one person's undervalued, everyone else makes up the difference. So that means that my friends from Kenwood and the people we played baseball against on the other high schools on the South Side that are being closed, they're making up the difference. And I said, we can do something about this, because we're in an age where I thought things were coming together, that we could use big data, we could use the cheapening computer power to go and look at and do this modeling better than had been done. That I knew that Chicagoans were sick of the favoritism, and they thought people had come to realize what the impact that had on the public and how that could be changed. I saw that we had greater data to show and illuminate how big buildings were being undervalued, and we could value them properly. And I also saw that people were just so sick of the favoritism that we could change the way the assessor's office worked and eliminate the inequities, because there are so many different inequities in the system. When big buildings are undervalued, when lower priced homes in Black neighborhoods are overvalued relative to richer homes in wealthy neighborhoods, and all the processes at the assessor's office just made the system even more warped. That appeals, as your home got more valuable, you were more likely to appeal. you were more likely to win your appeal, and the magnitude of reduction was bigger. So that's multiple levels of inequity right there. And I saw we could change all of this, and I'd like to do that. That's why I wanted to do it. And I said, I like managing money, but I like to do something else and try to fix this.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Williams, so you have, as your experience shows, you have been in this fight for fair housing for many decades, and it has been a long fight, I'm sure. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those big issues that you have seen that have been kind of most impactful for the families you've tried to help?
I want to thank you so much for certainly giving me the opportunity to talk about these things. But first, what's your name again?
Fritz.
Fritz, you're what? What's your job?
I'm the Cook County Assessor.
The Cook County Assessor. Fritz got right away pressure from some of the major groups in Chicago in his election. And there's so many in the room here will understand what those battles were. But I guess I admire him because he stood steadfast. And I've had an opportunity to see and be involved with many assessors, certainly from 1974 to now. I was in the 19th Ward, and I think you're familiar with. Yeah, yeah. So as we talk about our situation here, and it's more than just your office, it's all of the things that deal with real estate, not just housing, but real estate. And the fact that we're not, and I'm going to talk about us when I say we're not, taking the banner and leading. The things we're discussing today are things we were discussing 50 years ago. When Harold was preparing to run for mayor, in your book, that was a part of his campaign, was the inequity, unfairness. And Pat Quinn was riding his coattail, moving toward his election in state government. I say that to say this: it's not going to be given to us, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not going to be given to us. And unless we stand and sit at the tables and be a person at the table that's going to negotiate for what we've been denied, we're going to continue to have the problem. His book's not going to mean very much to us, and all the other books that we've had opportunity to read as we deal with it. We're talking about appraisal bias today. It's not the individual appraiser, it's the system. And we continue to let the system operate. And as long as it continues to operate in its 150-year fashion, because President Lincoln was the one that wanted to send us, colonize us, is that correct? Send us to South America and back to Africa. So let us start understanding about the history and about the so-called leaders that are standing out what we read in the books. And let's start asking the questions and negotiating the positions to make it better for us. So as I talk about that, I got in the real estate business because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something. I worked at the post office. Henry McGee was then the postmaster here in Chicago, and his son and I, who just finished his law work, we attended church together. And he said to me, Frank, yes, and I can help you move up, because I was carrying mail at Robert Taylor Home. Huh? Yeah, 1962 to 66. There's some history that we've got to deal with, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope and I pray to God that some of us start to stand up and really have the guts, because they're not going to give it to us. I swear they're not going to give it to us. But anyway, I will continue to do the things that I do. And some folks will not like the idea that I'm doing it, but I'll continue to do it.
We appreciate it.
Yeah, you next.
Professor Berry, we are so lucky to have you here, because we all know that, when we are trying to prove the case of things that we see in discrimination and other things. We need the numbers, we need the facts. So can you tell us a little bit about what some of your research has told us? And I know it's a lot of research, so I know that's a really wide question, but could you just kind of maybe introduce our audience to some of your research and some of the big themes that has emerged?
Sure. Rest assured, I have no slides. Everyone can read the side relief. First, just what an honor and pleasure to be on the panel with so many people I admire who work in this space. So thanks for inviting me. It's my pleasure. I think what I would start by saying is what the research shows in a nutshell is the more things change, the more they stay the same if we're looking nationwide. And I think the real advantage I've had, because Andrew is right to point out that we've had research in Chicago, at least going back to the 70s, showing these problems using various data. I think the real advance that has come is big data, which has allowed me to study the whole country. Because I think we had lots of studies of in this city or at that time, something was messed up. And people would say, oh, it must be that particular assessor. It must be some specific, something here and there. Well, you know, I was able to get data on the entire US and look at this problem and find that this problem is happening absolutely everywhere. This isn't because of one bad apple, one biased assessor who's playing favorites. It's happening everywhere. And I think when you see it happening everywhere, you begin to say, I think someone used the word systemic. Systemic racism is something that's happening everywhere, even when there's not one bad actor that's causing it to happen. It's baked into the system. And so what we'd like to know is how and why is it baked into the system? And the research can tell us about that too. I don't want to go into a lot of details on the statistics, but I'll give you a couple of reasons why it's baked into the system. One is assessing actually is a pretty hard job. I think Assessor Kaegi and his staff can tell you that. And so one of the things that tends to happen amongst assessors is all the statistical models we use tend to bias us towards the average, towards saying everybody is average. And when we say you're average, well, anybody who's above average is getting underassessed. Anybody who's below average is getting overassessed. And we could go into lots of details about these statistical methods, but all it's going to come back to is it's all biasing us towards averaging. And when we're averaging, we're going to have this form of regressivity. One particularly egregious form of averaging involves ignoring the variation across neighborhoods. So it's one thing to say, oh, you know, a 2-bedroom, 1,500 square foot apartment or condo is worth this amount on average. Well, yeah, maybe in some neighborhoods that average is right, but there's going to be a lot of neighborhoods where it's below and above. And one of the things I've seen just throughout the country is assessors are not reflecting this neighborhood level variation. Okay, and so I won't go into lots more details, but there's this systemic quality to this, and which is baked into how things are done, and those things need to change. And they can be changed. We're learning. So I say the first thing, that's what the research tells us. Another important thing, because this is happening everywhere, I think it's really important to point out, and Professor Karhl titles his book The Black Tax, and the racial aspect is super important. It's also important to know that even in places that are almost entirely white, take your county, some rural county that's 98% white, it's still the case that the people that own the lowest valued homes are overtaxed. And so what the research shows us is there's just a penalty for being poor, for owning a lower priced home. That applies to everybody. There's an additional penalty related to race on top of that. Okay, so what I would go even farther than what Professor Karhl said, and he quoted the 15% number that African Americans are 15% overassessed. That's the component that's just due to race. On average, the average home in an African American neighborhood is 55% overassessed relative to the other homes in the same jurisdiction. Okay, it's just that the racial component adds that additional. So it's the price, the fact that we overvalue low-priced homes in general, that African Americans are more likely, for many reasons we all know, to own lower-valued homes. That already we're going to be overassessed just for that, and then there's this racial penalty on top of that. So that's what the research tells us. I think a lot of politicians don't want us to see those connections between people of lower status, regardless of their race. They don't want that coalition of people forming. But I can tell you that this is happening everywhere. There's an additional penalty related to race. Later, we can talk about what can be done to fix it. But the systemic quality of it is clear. And again, it's just baked into the methods that we use. And people will say, oh, statistics are just objective. And well, no, we can look very specifically in the data and unpack exactly what's going on. It's no longer a mystery, and we can now do it for the whole country, and we can see it.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. CEO Scott. So, of course, your role is really complicated and really difficult, and you help a lot of folks, especially folks who cannot always afford to purchase a home. And so you see the entire market, right? You see all the issues. So can you talk a little bit about some of those structural issues that you see, especially with some of the families who might fall in the gap? Like maybe they can't quite get a home, but maybe they make too much for certain assistance programs.
Right. Thank you. And this is an esteemed body here, so I don't have a doctor in front of my name. I just do some of the hard work here. But so thank you for, you are a doctor by honorary. Yeah. Thanks for having me on here. We do see families, and we see families who are being taxed for being poor, essentially. It is very expensive to be poor. And some of the ways that comes out is certainly we're dealing with rent, and they're renting, but we also deal with families who are moving often. And so when we start talking about building wealth and building assets and creating opportunities for your children to have a consistent education, to then take hopefully that next generation, and so on and so on. When you are dealing with 70 or 80% of your income, and that's not the families we assist because we help with that, but when you have 70% of your income going towards your rent, and then you move and you think about things like deposits and dealing with your credit for every utility and every other, it's quite expensive to move. And so the ability to build assets enough to even get into home ownership is another whole step level of achievement, really, to get there. So I think that when we start talking about where families are, we also have to deal with education levels, income, and the fact that income is not tracking with the cost of home ownership or goods. And so getting ahead, you're always behind. And so so the subsidy that we provide for rental, the intention there, and public housing started as a temporary assistance to help families get past those sort of structural barriers that were already built there, which was they're always behind, to help them get ahead enough to build some of those assets. Still a lot of hard work to do because we've seen that gap between income and the cost to widen, actually. And so the system there are still areas that we have to work on to lower that gap, and in the meantime, use the tools that we have for the families that are ready, that have some means or have figured out some ways to start to move ahead, to move them a little bit faster, and then work with the other families that need more of those supports. But the system works against it, and frankly, it was built that way, and we're still working on it.
Thank you so much. Professor Berry, coming back to you. Actually, Assessor Kaegi, back to you for one moment, because we were just talking about those problems that you identified, but you all have been working on some solutions to these big issues. Would you mind chatting a little bit about those? And then we'll check in with Professor Berry, who has some more recent data that kind of shows some of the initial findings around what he's been seeing.
Sure. So what we realize is that we just could not take the software and the systems that were already there and just reapply them again, because that was where some of the bias was. It was built into the software, it was built into the methods, it was built into the processes. So we said we gotta rebuild this soup to nuts and show our work in the process. That was because building trust is important to this as getting it right. So we said, first of all, there's data science out there which can eliminate that tendency for averaging that Professor Barry was talking about. We don't want to average Woodlawn and Hyde Park, because if you just come up with a square foot average of Woodlawn and Hyde Park, you're going to overvalue Woodlawn and you're going to undervalue Hyde Park. And that kind of approach was happening thousands and thousands and thousands of times over in Chicago, which of course we all know has this landscape of segregation hardwired into it. So we said, all right, we need to use a kind of statistics that is ready for that kind of landscape. So we used a different kind of, first of all, we hired a team of people to construct models new rather than use off-the-shelf software, and construct models new that used methods that did not have this kind of averaging, but instead were much more sensitive to location, are much more sensitive to the actual conditions that affect the prices that people pay for their homes block by block in Chicago, looking at where is it relative to the CTA, where is it relative to environmental factors, where is it relative to schools? Because in some neighborhoods, this is more important, in others it's not. We have a huge city, a huge county that has very different conditions in just block by block, and we need to recognize that. Then we need to test our models repeatedly so that we are maximizing for the thing that is most important to us, which is equity. We said we're going to put equity at the center of what these models are trying to achieve. We want them to be accurate, but we also want equity to be just as important. So that's something that we hardwired into our work. And then we said we're going to write this software in a way so that everyone can see us as we're doing it. So we wrote the software on a platform called R. Now, I can't read R. I know most people can't read R, but we thought it was important to be accountable to experts out there who can look and look over our shoulders and watch us as we're doing it. Because we know we have generations of behaviors and suspicions that were rightly built up for all the things that Professor Karhl said. So that I said we have a real burden to bear in showing not only transparency, not only fairness, but also going above and beyond. So we want to be the most transparent. So we're going to put our model out there, have everyone see it, and then we're going to test it and show people what our results are doing. And then that can help us to course correct as we're seeing the results come in. But then also, it's important for building trust is eliminating all sense of even appearance of favoritism. So we said, we're going to let as a political figure, I'm not going to take any campaign contributions from tax lawyers. We're going to anonymize the process. We looked at other ideas. We looked at the Obama administration, which had published its visitors log, and we said, we like that. We're going to do that. Now, Trump changed that, but we thought that was a good thing. So we published our visitors log. We wanted to do everything that's showing our work to sort of start building trust, to say, hey, it's a different assessor's office from what Chicagoans and people in the suburbs have come to expect. And over time, maybe that starts to change some of these behaviors out there that had built in so many different problems. So that was how we could really aim at that inequity with residential assessments, where homes at the bottom of the spectrum were overassessed relative to ones at the top. And also we changed our processes for appeals. We said our analysts are going to have rigorous standards for how you evaluate appeals, so that we're not giving bigger preferences to people who have figured out how to put pressure on the system. We want to make the processes also equitable. We're going to take that equity lens to all of our processes when it comes to appeals, when it comes to outreach, and combine and give the public more information so they know their rights, so that there's not a disparity in terms of people availing themselves of rights that only some people know about. So we try to do all those things, and we can talk about results, but we thought that was a very important part of the solution. And then on commercial, we can talk about that. We started using a lot more sources of data. We started looking at what could be the inbred sources of bias that they were using in commercial before. And just like we did with residential, let's use better data that matches the market. Let's measure what we're doing, and then let's make ourselves accountable by publishing the results of what we're doing, and let's eliminate all sense of favoritism from the process. So that's what we did.
Thank you. Professor, what have you seen? When I look at my little tax bill, what should I be seeing?
I haven't looked at your tax bill. So first I say, and I hope Assessor Kaegi wouldn't be offended when I say this, I was pretty skeptical initially when he came into office, having tried to work with some previous assessors. So I went in, I would say, cautiously pessimistic. And but I will say, first I noticed that the first thing that kind of caught my notice is he hired one of my students as one of his first directors of data, and this particular student is not a person you'd hire if you didn't intend to do things the right way. I'll just leave it at that. And over the number of years, he hired some other students from our data science program, and so I started to see that. Remember, the guy before him hired his own sister. So we're talking about some very substantial, changes, and the transparency as well, posting the code, posting the data online. And so I began to be, somewhat more optimistic over time, but still sort of waiting to see the data. And we've just completed a study, which we'll release in the next couple of weeks, looking at the first 4 years under the Kaegi administration. And I just want to say, credit where it's due. The improvements have been absolutely remarkable on the residential equity in Cook County. And I would say, to put it in simple terms without getting into all kinds of assessment statistics, I would say about 75% to 80% of the regressivity has been repaired, which is, bravo. That's just absolutely remarkable in such a short span of time. And I would say, as Assessor Kaegi pointed out, one of the key innovations that allowed them to do this is vastly better modeling of this variation across neighborhoods and across space. Okay, that's one of the biggest flaws we see elsewhere. They implemented some fixes that really did work in that regard. And so there's, if you look at the maps before and after, and like the highlights or the hotspots of overtaxation are mostly gone. Now, it doesn't mean the system is perfect, and I won't be saying anything that Assessor Kaegi doesn't already know. The system isn't perfect. I think there's multifamily still can use some improvements. The south suburbs still has a way to go to improve that. So I'm just I want to give credit where it's due, and also point out what you already know are rooms to improvement. But to do this in a 4-year span is absolutely remarkable. And I want to go further to say, just the attitude of the office to host an event like this, to be as transparent as the event. I am fighting assessors, as I said. One of the benefits of big data is I get to do nationwide studies. One of the drawbacks is I then get to fight with assessors nationwide also. And I'm in a lot of places trying to give this same talk and make the same arguments where the assessors won't even admit the problem exists. And they're first, I say, what are you talking about? On average, we're getting it right. Right? That's the most common result. What do you mean? On average, I just explained why. But anyway, I just want to give a lot of credit where it's due for not only the results, which I think are quite remarkable, but also just for the transformation of the attitude of the office. And so, like I said, we'll release this study in the next couple of weeks, and I've been truly impressed with the turnout on residential. We can talk more about commercial if people are interested, but truly remarkable turnaround.
I just happened to mention a little bit earlier that for the past 50 years, I've lived in the 19th Ward. And I've had the opportunity to see, as we talk about, not only real estate taxation, but insurance. I lived in 60620 and 60619. Just take a look, brothers and sisters. You will start to stand up, your hair will start to stand up, and you'll stop playing games with it. There's a big difference. A granddaughter of mine had 2 accidents, not in Chevrolets, but in cars much larger. I still have the same insurance on my house and the automobiles. Now, you're talking about taking advantage. I've had that opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mr. Williams. CEO Scott, so all these things that we're talking about, it's all because families want to live and work and play and go to school and just take care of themselves, right? What do healthy neighborhoods look like when when families are like financially healthy? What does that look like?
You know it when you see it because you feel it, right? And so I want to go back real quick when I was talking about that the systems are sort of built around racism, frankly. And we know this story here in Chicago. It plays out in so many places in the US. And that has devalued the village that we know, where neighbors know neighbors, where you don't know the income of your neighbors. And it varies. It's not average. There are highs and there are lows. And we were used to neighbors being neighbors. And it didn't matter what your sort of race or income was. But also the devaluation where there was homogeneity in the neighborhood, where if it's people of color, that was okay if you were all being neighbors. And so nowadays we talk about mixed income, mixed use communities as being healthy, strong, safe communities, right? That's important because that diversity of incomes also drives the diversity of resources, whether it's schools, it's green space, it's grocery stores. It's those things that make that neighborhood strong are the things that you need every day. And so all families are looking for that. It doesn't really matter what income they are or whether they're renting or owning, because that also makes the neighborhood strong. It's the diversity of the neighborhoods that all families look for. But so much of the concentration is on either what you make versus who you are. And so when we look at the families that we're serving, the average income of those families is $14,500 a year. So when you talk about how do we get families to own assets and so on, there's a big leap to try to help them get there. But that shouldn't matter as long as they're good neighbors. And that's what we need to focus on. And the way the tax system is built too, building those strong neighborhoods, whether it's supporting schools and the money actually goes to the school to keep those schools strong, and that all neighbors value that and can benefit from that, it really becomes quite critical to building strong neighborhoods.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams, I know you want to add to that.
How is Lake Park Place functioning at this time? Rest Corp Realty, F.J. Williams Realty. We were the first as they developed Lake Park Place, because our intent was to prove that public housing, you understand, would work if all the things you just said, it's still working soundly after they moved us on to other things. But again, it's up to us. I don't know if Taft West is in here tonight. I know I invited him. He's here? Yeah, Taft. You understand? He was the field guy that was taking care of those functions, and he didn't play with it. He did his job.
Well, actually, if you don't mind keeping it, I just have one question planned for you, sir. Before we move on, and I'll have one last planned question for Professor Karhl before we open it up for the audience. We have a packed house in here full of people who I am sure everybody's here because we all want better for our city, for our neighborhoods, for us, and for our neighbors. What advice do you have for people who want to be a part of the change, a part of making this a better place?
I brought two pieces, if you don't mind me reading, very short pieces.
Go for it.
Thank you so very much.
See, you prepared. You ready?
Yeah, oh yes. First, let me say this, that to those I may have wronged I ask forgiveness. For those I may have helped, I wish I did more. To those I neglected to help, I ask for understanding. And that's one of the things that I think is important to all of us. And this here, the problem is not being uneducated. The problem is that people are educated just enough to believe what they have been taught and not educated enough to question anything from what they have been taught. And I think if we start questioning and getting in folks' face, you understand, we'll find that we'll get and accomplish our mission. But we've got to, and I'm talking about folks of color. It's about us. We can't keep waiting. We can't keep being intelligent. We've got to get in the face of the people who set the system, and we've got to start working at correcting the system. And I'm talking about across the board, the assessments, the assessor's office, appraising, brokerage, commercial real estate. And yes, the mayor appointed me to work with ResCorp at that time to be certain that we had someone that was there to assist the great ResCorp group in doing their proper job. I say to you, brothers and sisters, it's about us. It's about us. And if we don't do it, it ain't gonna happen. And believe me, I'm telling you what God loves, and that's the truth.
Thank you. Amen. So, Professor Karhl, as we, okay, and we'll have our first question. We're just gonna have him, and then we'll get you for our first question. So, as people pick up this amazing book and become empowered with all of the information and the history and the knowledge that's in it, what do you want people to take away after reading this book?
Yeah, I mean, while this book really focuses on a long-standing problem, and there's a lot of sort of frustration, I'm sure, in reading it because we see continually the sort of lack of change. It is a book that really tries to demystify these processes, to add clarity to what has been happening, to understand how this structure was built so that it can be unbuilt. And I think that's really, hopefully, the role that historians can play in helping to be, help encourage social change can be in helping to understand like how we got here so that we can begin to sort of understand like what to do next. And so one thing I think in particular also is to be more attentive to the sort of matters of public spending and taxation that happen in our communities. I always say you can learn a lot about a society by looking at how it raises and spends the public's money. And I think this, we live in a time of extreme inequality in America. And our tax system not only reflects that, but actually exacerbates it. And I think if we want to sort of start working toward a more equal and equitable society, we need to be mindful of how, we have to have a tax system that actually sort of works to encourage that, not only raising the necessary money that we need to address the problems that this and other cities face today, but also to do so in a way that actually doesn't make those problems worse. And I think one thing that that this book really can point to is just how, when it comes to local tax administration, when it comes to local property assessments, it works in a sort of manner to actually sort of fuel the very problems in housing markets that it reflects. And so one thing I think hopefully that we can do is begin to just, not see these as sort of problems that just sort of have no answers to them or things that are just kind of out there and unchangeable, but actually something that we can really begin to pinpoint. And that's why, again, the work that like Chris Berry has just been so instrumental in helping to shape and inform what it is I'm working on and putting it into a historical context so that now we today can begin to think about what to do about it.
Thank you so much. And so we're opening up for questions, and we already got our first one back there.
history, how the black community got ripped off to the tunes of billions of dollars by Joseph Barrows. But it goes back to Thomas Hines, who started this craft. And when Houlihan's came on the scene, he said he was going to fix it, which he did not. And then we got Joe Barrios. I interviewed him on my show. I did not think he was going to turn out to be a rat that he ended up in against taxpayers. And so we need to understand one thing, and I did pass out this copy to everybody. We found out, and this is where I think I have a slight issue with the fact. We got 9,000 units of government in the state of Illinois that cost us $33.8 billion in property taxes. We have 859 school districts that cost us $20.8 billion in property taxes. Cook County by itself have 140 school districts. 140. That makes no sense. And what I don't hear from the parents, and this is my third type of event like this, and plus I read the article that Andrew Karhl wrote about the black taxes and how it have destroyed our world. So what I like to hear from the parents, would you be willing to work with the coalition that support consolidation, liquidation, and the transformation of the property tax system in order for us to save our state and stop grandma and grandpa from losing their property because taxes is out of kilter and 61.5% of your tax bill go to these school districts. And if you understand our Constitution in the state, Article 10, Section 1, the state is responsible for funding education. In this state, they do a piss poor job. But that's why we need folks like you guys. I'm very proud. I'm very happy to see all of you here, blacks and whites. Because in order to fix what's wrong with our state, we're going to need everybody working in that vein. Free support getting the schools off the property tax system. We got other folks who support that. But the problem, and we're going to make with the Speaker of the House, we're going to make with the President of the Senate. These folks don't want to do a damn thing to fix this problem that they just got you outlined. And that's why we're going to need all of you guys working together. The business community, the real estate, the developers. Okay. So we need all of them to come together, but we need that panel to give us some concrete answers to support what we're trying to look at to save our state.
So Anthony, I'm not sure everyone heard it, but Anthony really talks about how so much waste and inefficiency with all our different units of government is one important part of why this property tax system is so messed up. And there are many other parts of it too. And he says, I've met with a lot of people in Springfield and they just don't do anything. And the last thing he said is the one that's really echoing me here is that we are all going to have to work together, all different racial groups. Many people have different kinds of interests in different parts of the system to collectively make it better. Because as an eyewitness, I've been down in Springfield trying to get changes in our property tax system, and you go into a room with all the stakeholders, the people who are supposed to be looking at all the different parts of the system, and you look around the table at these stakeholders. You have the tall building owners. You have the people who own the big box stores. You have the people who are from the various different business groups. You have people from the tax lawyers. You have people from all these other interests. And I'm looking out around here, I'm around the table. I'm like, well, who's representing homeowners around this table? And folks in Springfield don't say it, but they don't think that you or the public think this is important. It's just they don't think that the public thinks this is important. And that's why they don't do anything. And when you read Professor Karhl's book, it is a story of multiple times heroic people, Jesse Jackson, Harold Washington, so many other people from different communities who recognize the injustice of this in trying to do something. You see reform impulse starting, backed by research, and then stalling. And what is missing? As far as I see it, Anthony, you can check me on this. There's still a void of that representative down in Springfield who speaks for homeowners. There needs to be a group, there needs to be a movement that advocates for fairness in property taxes. Harold Washington had 100% the right idea, and that, man, there's so many things that were wrong in him being cut short in 1987. Every time I go over that bridge over to Indiana, that's when I heard it on the radio. But there needs to be some kind of movement, some kind of organization. I know I see a lot of young people out here in the audience. There does need to be some kind of, there's a void right now in advocating for change here. And I think this is true in many parts of the country too, because we see assessors out there who, you know, in politics and in government, they're two different kinds of people. There's a people who want to be somebody, and there's a people who want to do something. Most people want to be somebody. And the assessors out there, they just want to be the assessor. And they really don't want to rock the boat. And so to change things, you need some outside force. And sometimes research or studies come out which show the great injustice of what's going on. And then that gets people mobilized. And we are so lucky that we have elections here to actually bring about that change. In parts of the country, you don't have that. The assessor's appointed by some political machinery, and God help you if you want to change it there. But we have to figure out how to bring out these changes that are authentic to our local communities. And what is good is that we have more research out there to identify where the injustice is. And we have people out there to tell the stories. And you have told the story in your book so wonderfully, but we need people out there who are mobilizing, who are organizing, so that change could be brought about. Because we've been able to do a lot of things within the four walls of the assessor's office that we talked about, but the really big change in the state is a Springfield problem. They determine how our schools are funded. When we're 50%, when we're dead last in America for funding our school districts at the state level, you know, we fund 25% of our school districts at the state level. Here in Indiana, it's 50, and that's more like the national average. You know, that change is really important, and there needs to be more mobilization for it.
Just Anthony, first, thanks for the kind words. Just a couple of real quick points. You mentioned Jason Grotto. We hadn't talked about him yet today, but I really would like to single him out. He was the reporter from the Tribune who wrote those tax divide stories. Certainly, I wouldn't be sitting here today if he hadn't written those stories. I don't think, in honesty, Fritz would be sitting here in the assessor's office if he hadn't written those stories either. So the importance of the press in terms of who is getting this out. I mean, it's not enough to do the research as an academic, but the story has to be told. And kudos to the Tribune. I do worry about what's happened to it since and who's going to be telling these stories now. Secondly, Anthony, you mentioned the proliferation of local government units. I'm absolutely on your side. In fact, my first book was on that very topic, Imperfect Union. And I would tell you all, if everyone here buys a copy of the Black Tax on the way out, it will already have sold more copies than my book. So in any case, please, I agree with you 100%. I've written a book on it. Pass that over to
Yeah, I'll just quickly add really quickly. I think you're absolutely right that the proliferation of all these local tax districts fuels these problems, because not only do you see within jurisdictions African-American communities being overassessed, but you also see these vast disparities in the size of tax bases, which ensures that people living in wealthy communities with large tax bases are essentially going to be have to pay less and get more. And conversely, you see in areas that are suffering from smaller tax bases with greater needs, that's also going to ensure that everyone living within those areas are going to have to pay more and get less. And so this is part of the problem. And in fact, all those school districts, all those suburbs that were growing by leaps and bounds during those years were very much a part of this system and the injustices we see today.
You said about school districts.
Okay. Sorry.
I have a son that teaches at Neuqua Valley High School. You understand? So that's what we're talking about today. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah. Or I can repeat what she says if you can. Yeah. Yeah.
Young pregnant mother, grew up in the projects, continue my education. But this, I want to know what incentives are being used today. I know back in those days in 1968, the incentive was to move when the elevators no longer worked. High gas taxes, gas prices, night board. Not people's gas, another incentive. CTA bus transportation. I had to park at 16th Street in order to get to work on time. When I can come to Naperville in 38 minutes to get to work. What incentive is being used today to motivate them in their education? Which I know they closed 50 schools in Chicago.
Say that.
And my nephew is coming back here tonight, next month, to incentivize children to do better. Because he came from the south side of Chicago. And he is Michael Jordan's chief design person. So I'm just saying that everybody doesn't have the ability to do these things, but what is being used in public housing now to give incentives to planners to do that.
So thank you very much for your question. The question, I guess, was, and thank you, you said that you grew up in Robert Taylor homes. And we were talking about what strong communities are made of. For those of you who don't know, Robert Taylor was the chair of CHA. And he left with this vision that strong communities had all those resources for the people who lived in the communities. And so it's a bit ironic that public housing was named after him, because he really felt that it needed to have all those resources and that the funds were there, that there were good education options, that the resources around. Today, our model, we're going back to that, right? That village. And in doing that, we're also making sure that families have the support that they need to move forward. So we start first with the subsidy, which is that they're only years. So as you start to build income, that you also can have the opportunity to build some savings. We have scholarship programs. We have free tuition arrangements with city colleges. And for seniors, which is also important, that they're in those communities, we're providing food supports and so on, which is almost Indiana. And their studies show that families, the 1,000+ families that live in Oakdale Gardens on the south side, have more than an hour and a half added onto their commute to get to the closest job center. So the idea that public transportation is so critical to families moving ahead, and that's the work that a housing authority can do in creating those partnerships and relationships to bring those resources to families and communities that have been disinvested over time. And I think of that vision of that strong community as about being about Mr. Robert Taylor.
So unfortunately, we only have time for two more. This gentleman in the back, and then this gentleman on this side, because I know I've been neglecting this side. So.
This fall we're going to have a referendum on the November ballot. It's called Reconstruction Era Reparation Act. Now, a rerun, and what it is basically we're asking for 3 cents from the county, Cook County, and we're asking for 3 cents from Chicago, and this is coming from the sales tax. So that sales tax, that 3 cents, which is 6 cents, we want to multiply that by the trillion. Within 6 months, there's 6 trillion transactions that occurs in Cook County. So that money would go into a fund to pay all of the descendants of slaves property taxes and the services that's needed in the community while the state gets their situation straight, while the state gets their process straight, because we know that takes time. When you do a 6 trillion transaction times 6, you get $60 billion within 6 months. In 12 months, you get $180 billion. So this would take care of the community. A trillion is 12 zeros, okay? So basically, this is what we're trying to do, and
we appreciate you. Gonna be in the back at the end if people want to talk to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
This
Okay.
is the petition.
Okay. We just gotta.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Right back, and then you got a question in the front. Okay, we'll come to you at the end.
And I promise there'll be a question. Working with NHS Chicago on the west side for the last 14 years, we've seen the differences in property taxes, so we commend the work of the assessor's office.
And we're really proud to be in Cook County, where there's something called a senior freeze that really makes the difference, keeping low and moderate income seniors in their homes as property values rise. It's been amazing. And I wasn't going to talk about this, but Mr. Williams mentioned it. And it's kind of a question for the academics, and how can we study it? The price optimization we're seeing by the insurance industry. Ms. Jones paying $6,053 to farmers, and after simple comparison shopping, paying $1,600. Mr. Daniel paying $5,967 to Safeco after simple comparison shopping, $1,211. Insurance companies are not regulated. At least with loans, we can count them. We've got, HMDA and the CRA Act, but insurance companies, there's nothing. And it's just the latest strip mining of equity freeze for keeping people in their homes. But the insurance industry is killing us. And it's forcing people to fall behind on their mortgages. And they love escrow. They love their payments being paid by the mortgage company. So sorry about that, Mr. Williams.
Yeah, I love you too. I can just comment real briefly. As someone who's been in finance for a long time, old wine, new bottles. Old wine, new bottles. Things that happened before are brought back again in a whole new suit of clothes. Price optimization for insurance, that's just another word for discrimination, right? It's the same thing, right? That's just what I wanted to say. Like in the world of finance, one of the things that makes all of this hard is it takes a lot of staying power to bring about change, because the things that want to do old things, they will shape shift. They will try to wait you out. In working on economic equity issues, and I see we have some elected officials here. We have Cook County Commissioner Tara Stamps here. Working on economic equity issues takes concentration and focus and staying power, and a lot of people working together, and that is not easy. But that's what I just want to say about that.
That's why. Okay, and then 1 and 2, please.
My name is Andrew Karhl, Illinois Black Wall Street, and the author of House Resolution 1320 and the Black Wall Street Act, and the socioeconomic balance. We talked about the housing. However, there's a socioeconomic balance when it comes down to commercial property ownership in African American communities as well. Because a lot of the African American communities that are in those communities, those homeowners are also commercial property owners. So when they lose one property, they end up losing everything. So what type of policy, what type of measures are being taken? And this is a great diverse panel. Wanting to know what type of policies or what type of focal is there on creating that social economic balance in Black communities?
Well, building on what Professor Berry said, that in residential, there's a tendency to overassess homes at the bottom end of the price spectrum and underassess at the top in residential. That same tendency happens in commercial too. It's just harder to discover the data about that, which Professor Berry might be able to tell you about. But when studies have been done in Cook County, looking at commercial properties, there has been a pronounced tendency for the smaller commercial properties, the ones in the neighborhoods, to be overassessed relative to the larger commercial properties downtown. And actually, I think that tendency is even greater, because it's good enough for us to talk about immense problems, but we must come up with solutions. So the solution is, just like with residential, is use better modeling process. You don't build in bias. So don't assume a retail property at 63rd and Halsted is the same as a retail property downtown. You need to be able to see that vital difference. And so we have been all about trying to get better data that we do through self-help, through building our own data, through subscribing to better data, going out and talking to people so that we can see the difference. I grew up on the South Side. 43rd Street, 53rd Street, 63rd Street, and 71st Street are so different. You can't believe it. But there's not one national real estate database that shows that difference that we can subscribe to. So we all need to build better data so that we can get rid of that bias that hurts the small commercial property owner in the neighborhood. So we've been working on a bill in Springfield for 6 years that would require commercial properties to just give us some basic data about this so that we could see that difference better. It has been hard to get that through Springfield because of a lack of interest. So, but that's where I think the solution is. Also, eliminating favoritism on commercial properties is another big part of that. We could talk about that too.
Okay, let's talk about that. Also, at the risk of, I don't know who else here, but another part of the study which we'll be releasing is on commercial, and we can see the evidence that the Assessor Kaegi's office has begun to correct some of those inequities in the way that commercial property is assessed. But we've also seen that the Board of Review has undone a lot of that via the appeals process. So there's so many different parts of this system that, although we've made a change in the assessor's office and we've seen positive results, there's so many other parts of the system that also need to be reformed that we can't give up. It's not a mission accomplished moment. And I will say, in commercial in particular, we're really seeing that the efforts at reform that are going on there are being largely undone by the billions of dollars of tax value that's being taken off the rolls at the stage of the Board of Review. So
the elementary, Watson, the 4 cycles of a neighborhood, each one is planned. A group of people set at a table and plan. And we've got to have folks sitting at the table that have the guts to say, no, it needs to work this way in this community and that way in another community. And so, yes, and we start looking at the 4 cycles, you understand? So it just don't happen that we're in a deteriorated area. It just doesn't happen because they're redeveloping. It happens because a group come together and make plans. We've got to start doing that together.
Can you take us home with the final question, please?
Yes, thank you for your patience with our Commissioner Tarzan. It's late, so I got a couple of things. A, how many units of public housing is CHA still sitting on in the wake of the decimated public communities like Cabrini Green, where I grew up, and the plans for transformation, which also was a failed mission with regard to the Black poor people that live in Cabrini Green. So how are you all, with all of the programs that you mentioned, A, publicizing that to residents or Chicagoans, that they can even get back in the city, because that's an issue, and then B, how much stock are you all actually sitting on that people who are housing insecure can actually take advantage of?
So thank you for the question about Cabrini Green. Cabrini Green is actually a success in terms of
Not to blame.
work. Well, so when we have with Partners Built
over 3,500 new apartments in the Cabrini Green area where we sit here right now. And there are, in terms of the list from 1999, the 10-199, there are less than 200 families on the list for our entire portfolio who have the right to return to the public housing that was torn down. And so we take that very seriously whenever we're doing new developments and so on, to make sure that those families are contacted so they have the opportunity if they do want to come back to the area, if they have moved out of the area. And so I think when we talk about the ability to access housing, it is, what's important is that we continue to build new housing throughout the city, as well as preserve the housing that we have. And so we have a priority around preserving the housing. So all of our senior buildings, rehabbing those, and many of our family properties have been rehabbed. And we continue to put money into them. So, because in fact, it's not easier, but it's certainly less cost, it's more cost effective to make sure that we are rehabbing the stock that we own versus trying to build new. That there's a big differential there. The one thing I do want to mention too, in terms of going back to the one question about resources, is that in Chicago, it's not just about rental, but the Chicago Housing Authority, we have some flexibility where we have home ownership programs. And that, I think, goes to where we're rebuilding communities, because we want to give access to families to own their homes, but in an affordable way. And so we use the subsidy that we get from the federal government also to help families get into new homes, and we continue to expand that. We opened a new program in 2023 for down payment assistance. And so that's helping families to move forward. And I think that's really important when we talk about building strong communities, that it's not just about the rental side, which housing authorities are traditionally thought to be, but also on the home ownership side, and using that federal money to
100 people. Why have those displaced residents been rehoused in this length of time?
They have the right to return, and we contact and do outreach all the time with those families. It is their choice. And so I'd be happy to talk with you more afterwards about that.
But those families have choice, and we have opportunities, and where those are, we make sure that they're aware of them.
The question was, can we automate freezes? We could. So the question is, so what is the freeze? Because some people don't know what the freeze is. There's a program called the Senior Freeze. Actually, our friends in Springfield gave it the spiffy new name of the Low Income Senior Freeze. Like maybe they're trying to discourage people from claiming it or something. But what it does is that if your income is below $65,000 in your household, housing values rise. It keeps your assessment in place. It reduces your share of the burden. but it is tested. They test your income every year to qualify. They could automate it if they would give us access to the income information that the state has. There is an agency, the Illinois Department of Revenue, that knows everyone's income every year. And they have this program that they created that's one of the most valuable benefits to you, Commissioner Stamps, and so many others, to make sure that people are reapplying for those exemptions that they had before. We see in this era of big data so many situations like this where people's lives are made so much harder by a lack of action in sharing data between two different parts of government. And so that's what we could do to make it automated. But they would have to take the affirmative step to make it available to us, because we have the computing power to do it now.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is such an important topic, as we can see, and we just want to thank our panel. Professor Karhl will be set up in the back to sign books. And if you're interested in more events like this,